Hey there, everyone. Today I would like to discuss Louis Armand's essay Mind Factory From Artifice to Intelligence. In this essay, Armand tries to approach Finnegans Wake as providing a sort of preliminary theory of mind, and that through its problematics of language and textuality, culture, religion, and history, it is presenting us with a particular way that the mind works. And Armand uses this as an incisive and instructive moment for understanding artificial intelligence and for understanding things like consciousness. So he's going to be talking about Dewey and Wittgenstein and a number of different theorists regarding theories of language, and show how Finnegans Wake intersects with those in order to act as a sort of technology. Because Finnegans Wake has always been at the cutting edge of technology. The first book to use the word television is Finnegans Wake. Joyce has often been called, by Jacques Derrida, for example, at one of the Joyce symposiums, Derrida called Finnegans Wake a 1000th generation computer. So there's always been this theorizing of Finnegans Wake as a sort of futuristic technology, that it pushes language to the point that textuality is starting to burgeon into a new medium. Now, if we want to understand Finnegans Wake as presenting us with theories of mind and technology, first we have to understand its theories about language and textuality. And the great question that the Finnegans Wake theorist has when confronting this text is, to what extent is it just an exemplar of our everyday linguistic paradigms? And to what extent is it an exception? Armand says it is arguable that Finnegans Wake does not, in fact, require us to break with existing reading habits or to invent new semiologies. Rather, it requires that we scrutinize the unexamined assumptions belonging to these existing habits and seek to come to a greater understanding of what we call ordinary language and common sense, their function, their machinery, as it were, and the possibilities available to them. For Joyce does not pose a language or thought of exceptions in the writing of Finnegans Wake, but rather a general condition of language as such. And this condition must be generalizable across the whole field of existing intellectual habits for it to be possible at all. Right, so to some extent, Finnegans Wake is confronting us on similar terms. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to read it at all. Right, like Finnegans Wake is a legible artifact that we can in fact pick up and read, even if we can't reduce it to one or even a small panoply of meanings. So Finnegans Wake is approaching us with certain expectations of language that we hold in common with Finnegans Wake. There is some common ground that it shares, and a lot of the great jokes and puns and the magic of Finnegans Wake is happening not by exceeding everyday paradigms, but by deconstructing them from the inside, by imploding them under the laws of their own existing structures, right? It's showing that, oftentimes we conflate these words together, and Joyce plays with the conflation of those words. Or these myths have a very similar structure, and therefore he's going to, equivocate and conflate in a way that's humorous and ironic and farcical. So Joyce is not going beyond our world, but as many people have talked about, it's really a summary of Western culture or of, humankind or of the cosmos, right? It's acceding to the laws of certain paradigms, not trying to find some meta to that paradigm. And this is something that post-structuralist theorists have long understood about Joyce's oeuvre as a whole. I think of Colin McCabe in James Joyce and the Revolution of the Word, who says that one of Joyce's biggest contributions is the denial of meta-language. All we have is language within certain paradigms. And Armand comes on the scene and says the question immediately obtains as to whether there is such a thing as semantic verifiability, or whether there are merely linguistic structures defined by habitual use or misuse. Right? So this is the great question of someone who confronts Finnegans Wake and is trying to figure out how to cope with its language. right? Because we're trying to, of course, theorize about it, but on the most literal sense, just to read it is to try to cope with it and to try to rest it, to make sense of it in a way that, in some irrevocable way, is reducing and changing it. So the question is, can we approach Finnegans Wake with some meta language, some way by which we can get a bird's eye view, or are we always already inside Finnegans Wake? And Derrida has said this about Joyce's oeuvre as a whole, but especially Ulysses and Finnegans Wake, that anything that can be said about them is to some extent predicted by them, because the laws of saying that we would use to say anything about them are already problematized and self-reflexively being made aware of to the text self already. As such, there is an irrevocable sense of always already being enveloped and inside something that, right? There is no outside text, as Derrida puts it, right? Il n'y a pas hors texte. Therefore, Armand locates in Finnegans Wake a conflict between mere coincidence and coherence. This is a conflict which he says may be seen as underwriting Finnegans Wake, with its countless acrostics, acronyms, mnemonics, codes, neologisms, puns, portmanteau, sigla, footnotes, marginalia, hand drawings, and so on, and which can be illustrated by reference to any arbitrary selected passage from that book. Because as we approach Finnegans Wake, the question is always, to what extent is our reading merely the product of our circumstances, in other words, some random coalescing of information and therefore coincidence? And to what extent is it response to the structural integrity of the text, right? To what extent does it latch onto some coherence that is essentially part of the text? And of course, anti-essentialist as Finnegans Wake is, it's always challenging this ability to essentially reduce the text to some base level or to some metaphysics of presence, as Derrida would put it. So what Armand wants to do is see Finnegans Wake as always alluding a reduction to either of these poles. He says, in this way, Joyce also demonstrates, to borrow a felicitous passage from John Dewey's Essays in Experimental Logic, that linguistic events do not cohere. At the most, certain sets of them happen more or less frequently than other sets. The only intelligible difference is one of frequency and coincidence. Right, so there are no objective criteria for correctness or semantic verifiability. All we have is linguistic structures of habitual use or misuse, and the expectations to see certain things in frequently arrayed units. And we use these expectations to guide what we see as more or less favorable, but there's no meta language, no meta discourse to assure us that this is by necessity, that this is more than mere coincidence. Of course, it could be some apprehension of the eternal structure of Finnegans Wake. I think about Joyce mentioning in part 3 that part of it is structured as the Via Crucis, the way to the cross, so the 14 stages of the cross. And scholars have been trying to figure out exactly where that is and still have been unable to find it. So Joyce is always, and this is just one example, always intimating at some structural contiguity that permeates the wake, and yet it always seems to slip through our fingers. We always get the sense of these ordered quadripartite cycles, right? Or tripartite plus a recurso from the Viconian schema in Finnegans Wake. We also get the sense of binarism, of the beginning and end being mirrors of each other, and of different chapters being mirrored, especially the Night Lessons chapter where Shem and Sean, their side notes, their marginalia switch sides about halfway through the chapter. So there are all these senses in which Finnegans Wake is betraying structure when we try to investigate, biographically what Joyce said about it, or what scholars have come to find out through genetic research or things like that. And yet we can always get the sense that Joyce is denying some essential coherence to the text, and therefore to language and to mind and thought as a whole, that we do not have the fetters, but all we have is this ineluctable, rude breathing on the void of to be, as Joyce puts it in Finnegans Wake. Armand continues that likewise, Joyce's text indicates that it is the matter and not simply the meaning or content of ideas that is associated, right? So it's equally a question about the materiality of words coming together in certain arrays that makes them do what they do. More than just the meaning that we ascribe to them or the content that we claim that they represent or signal, it's also a question of materiality, which is irreducible to the hermeneutic or to the narrative, right? And this extends, Armand says, beyond the probabilistic arrangement of individual lexemes to a generalized typography or tropography, extending through the entire schema and elementa. In effect, Finnegans Wake enacts a radical parataxis in which each aspect of signification is revealed in the possibility of open communication with every other. And it is on the basis of this radical possibility, seemingly so alien to ordinary language, that the Wake affects to demonstrate a general condition of signifiability, that is, of language as such. And we might say of the brain as such, because this is very similar to what a lot of neuroscientists have come to find out about neuroplasticity and about the fecundating capacity of the brain to radically signal and form connections of open communication with new parts, and to accrete these, and through repetition, to establish these territories which accrete in the, to form memories. So all of this shows how Finnegans Wake is really accepting these accretive facts of everyday language. I mean, think about the fact that the only reason we feel that everyday language is so stable is because it has had so much time to accrete, and therefore its habitual use or misuse doesn't seem in question. But Finnegans Wake questions everyday language to a significant extent. It really wants to argue fundamentally that there is nothing easy about language. So beyond the ease, Joyce does want to show the fecundity of language, right? Armand says that Joyce's text demonstrates that it is not linguistic factuality, but rather linguistic situations that give rise to intelligibility. And this difference between linguistic factuality and situations is subtle, but I think what he's trying to say here is that there's not some innocent, authentic linguistic presence where words just mean what they mean, right? They just factually, out of necessity, must be connected to the thing that they supposedly refer to, right? The signifier and the signified being ineluctably connected. Instead, it is only situationally, and this is really a point of Saussure, right, that signs only get their meaning through relations to other signs, and therefore they have this illusory necessity in terms of the relation to the signified that they're supposedly bound to. And this, in fact, is our horizon for intelligibility. So we can see that there's a lot more to do with habitualness and probability than there is some essential essence. Armand says the material situation defined by Joyce's paratactic writing can otherwise be regarded as an effect of what we might call a literate technology, wherein a certain mechanics of thought finds its antecedent. And the antecedent is, this is problematic for people like Derrida because it makes talking about Finnegans Wake in an original way impossible, because Derrida goes to a great extent to show how the way that Finnegans Wake already sort of auto-poeticizes, and self-theorizes, prevents us from saying something that doesn't already have its antecedent in the text. In other words, our thoughts have the antecedent in the thing that we are thinking about. They've already kind of thought our thoughts. So in that way, Armand is trying to show that Finnegans Wake is, in some small modicum of way, intelligent. It is a model of artistic and artificial intelligence. He says that Finnegans Wake demonstrates the inherent relatedness of techne and any form of literate praxis or poesis. It is this latter aspect of the wake that indicates the way in which techne is always linked to a certain possibility of invention, and above all, at that point at which ordinary intelligibility appears to break down. The limits of my language is my world, to return to a Wittgenstein phrase that he's quoted earlier, describes a boundary beyond which intelligibility enters into a crisis, but only in the sense that this crisis itself is a necessary techne of invention, of possibility as the antecedent of thought. So thinking of Finnegans Wake as this refuse of possibility, of antecedents and excess without fetters, right, without a priori necessity, is really our way into theory in the first place. It is the precondition, the open ruf, right, the call that Heidegger talks about, by which we are allowed to interface with literature at all. So this openness, this textual plasticity, is the very means by which we can go beyond the limits of our language and confront something wholly other, which is Finnegans Wake, right? It is in some irreducible way an other entity which starts to take on a sort of subjectivity of its own. Therefore, Armand concludes, between thought and intelligibility, then, exists a technological movement of redefinition and re-relation, in whose dynamic we might say intelligence itself is somehow constituted. This ambidual dynamic, as Joyce says, comprises the situation we might call Joyce's mind factory. That's a quote from Finnegans Wake. And it is on this basis that Finnegans Wake assures and assumes its single importance in the step away from analogical thought towards the material foundations of an experiential or experimental thought. So in some important way, Armand is trying to get us to accede to the idea that Finnegans Wake is an experimental model for thought, that the structural relations cohering between the material is in some important sense an analogy of and mimetic of human brain, thought, and function. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat interesting. I love everything that Armand has to write, and it's always very thought-provoking and very densely but cogently and tactfully argued. So I hope that this has been interesting. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it really helps me out, and I appreciate anyone who donates. It takes a lot of pressure off me and makes me more inspired to make things. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.